in trauma psychology and helping people, that I can be part of a voice at the table, part of that push to get policy and understanding, especially with the insurance companies, to make sure that people are getting, the appropriate care that they deserve. So it's something that just has always been part of my life in varying degrees. And as a psychologist, I feel like it's a very rewarding part of my job.
Do you attend professional conferences?
Yes, I do, typically multiple times a year. Of course, COVID threw a little bit of a wrench in that, since some things are virtual, but yes, I routinely attend conferences.
And why do you think that's important?
It's important to stay abreast of developments in the field. It's important to meet with your colleagues across the country and see what they're doing and what they're hearing and what's working and what's not working. So when you're at a conference and somebody's presenting new or novel research, then you can take that information and bring that back to your clients and bring that back to my forensic work. So it absolutely enhances the work that I do.
Have you ever been qualified to testify in the field of psychology as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
I was first qualified in 1998, so since then, about 50 times.
Okay. And how often in that 50 times has the specialty been in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress?
Probably more than half.
Okay. Have you ever worked for or testified for the prosecution in criminal matters, like the District Attorney's Office, U.S. Attorney's Office?
Yes, I have, frequently.
Okay. Do you testify for both sides in lawsuits, plaintiffs and defendants?
Yes, I do.
Have you ever worked on other cases that didn't go to trial?
Many.
Okay. Have you ever found an individual that you evaluated did not suffer from the effects of interpersonal violence or PTSD?
Frequently.
Okay. Have you ever not been qualified in court where you have been proffered to qualify as an expert in the court?
No.
Okay. Your Honor, I would at this time move to qualify Dr. Hughes as an expert in forensic psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
All right, any objection?
No objection to qualifying her as an expert in forensic psychology.
All right.
More specifically, forensic psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
Any objection?
No.
All right, so moved.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hughes, please tell the jury what domestic violence, intimate partner violence means.
Sure. So I'm probably going to be interchanging the language, domestic violence and interpersonal violence, and for purposes here, these are the same thing. So intimate partner violence is a pattern of manipulation, fear, and coercive control that happens within an intimate relationship. It constitutes using a variety of abusive behaviors, and that can be physical violence, sexual violence, psychological aggression, emotional abuse, stalking or surveillance behaviors, and economic abuse. The abusive behaviors occur over time, not all at once, and they're also interspersed with very normal times without violence, times with love and happiness, and it's this interpositioning of the violence with the love and the abuse, with the love and the care, that makes it very difficult for a victim to extricate herself from that situation and from that relationship.
And what would you say is the overarching dynamic of these relationships?
So the overarching dynamic is the abuse of power and control of one person wanting to have dominance in that relationship, say over most things that the couple or that the victim does or does not do.
Please tell the jury what coercive control means.
So coercive control is a tactic of victimization. The goal of it is to establish dominance. What coercive control does is that it imposes negative consequences for noncompliance with your partner's expectations or demands. And what that does is it erodes away at the victim's autonomy and her independence.
What is physical violence?
So physical violence is when one person uses their body against the body of another with the intent to cause injury or harm. That can be push, shove, slap, kick, punch, beat up, meaning multiple types of physicality in one instance. throw, slam into a wall, push into something hard that you could hurt yourself. Clearly, use of a weapon would be a physically violent act as well.
Does size and strength matter between the parties?
Yes, very much so. This is very well documented in the literature about violence and abuse in relationships, and that's just physics. That's just proportional force. That if a 185-pound man is going to push a 120-pound woman, that's going to feel quite different than a 120-pound woman pushing a 185-pound man. And it's just about proportional force and the size and strength differential. And that is why specifically, if you look at wrestling or boxing, they match weight classes. And they do that for a reason, because they know that it's not fair if somebody is bigger and stronger than the other. So it's certainly not the only factor, but it is a factor that one has to consider if a relationship is violent.
What is psychological aggression?
So psychological aggression is threats and the imposition of threats with the intent to control someone's behavior. So it's doing a threat so that you will modify your behavior and do what your partner wants. Some psychological aggression techniques are intimidation. Slamming your hand on a table, punching a wall, throwing something, mumbling under your mouth, cursing, screaming, sort of these high emotional balance type of activities that can cause a victim to feel afraid and feel intimidated. And then if there has been an act of physical violence where that contingency has already been established, that this person, your partner, has said, okay, I not only have the ability to use violence against you, I also have the willingness to do it. The intimidating tactics take on greater flavor. They take on greater salience. They mean more because you know what could be coming down the pike.
What is emotional abuse?
So emotional abuse functions to denigrate a person's sense of self-worth and their self-perception. It's about name-calling, being very mean-spirited, putting yourself down, using gender-based language that's offensive, racial slurs, all types of behaviors to really make a person feel less than they actually should.
And what is sexual abuse?
So sexual abuse in an intimate relationship functions to establish dominance and establish power. What it is simply in the psychological and psychiatric communities is forcing someone to do something sexual against your will when you did not want to. It can be forced sex, either forced vaginal, oral, anal sex, and be forced to engage in any other type of sexual act that you may not want to do. And when I say force, it doesn't mean it has to have physical force. There's a lot of psychologically coercive tactics that are used that many times when violence has already been established in the relationship, the victim often feels that she can't say no for fear of reprisal, for fear of retaliation for saying no to those acts. So sexual abuse, does happen in intimate partner relationships. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to ask about it because it makes people very uncomfortable.
Is digital penetration of the vagina sexual abuse?
Action leading.
What, if any, role does digital penetration of the vagina play in sexual abuse?
If it is non-consensual, then it is abusive.
What, if any, penetration of inanimate objects into the vagina plays a role in sexual abuse?
Again, the operative word is consensual. If you are not consenting to those acts, then it is sexually abusive.
Okay. Is there a distinction between sexual violence and sexual abuse?
Not really. Sexual violence is a term of art. It is the overarching umbrella that we in the psychological and psychiatric communities talk about. So if we are looking at our diagnostic and statistical manual and say what are the traumas that could cause PTSD, it's listed as sexual violence. So it's an umbrella term that allows us to understand it could be childhood sexual abuse, it could be a rape, a sexual assault, it can be sexual abuse in an intimate relationship. So it's really just an overarching term that we use in the field.
What are
So I'm sorry.
I'm
So
sorry,
it
go
doesn't
ahead.
mean, I think people often mistake it to mean that when you are being sexually abused, that someone's punching you, or someone's hitting you, or someone's doing something like that because you hear the violence. It does not mean that. That could happen, but that term does not require that, nor does it mean that.
What are stalking or surveillance behaviors?
So stalking and surveillance behaviors are a common tactic of typically men who use violent behaviors in an intimate relationship. What they do is they allow the woman to know that wherever she is, wherever she goes, he's going to know. I'm going to maybe look at your phone, see who you're talking to, track you on Find My iPhone, look at your Instagram, look at your emails, really having a way of knowing all of the personal information about you. And what that does, it again erodes the victim's autonomy and it erodes her sense of privacy. She doesn't feel that wherever she can go, that somewhere he's not going to be part of her life in a very objectionable way. Sometimes there's the pop-ins. They'll show up at places that they're not supposed to be and that we don't want them to be, just as a way of checking. Sometimes they'll have friends or family check up on their partners to make sure where they are. What time did you get home? But you didn't turn off your phone at this time, but you came in the door this time. Like all of the sort of constant questioning and interrogation about an individual's whereabouts.
What about economic abuse? What is that?
So economic abuse is a way to, again, continue to maintain control over your intimate partner. Sometimes it's withholding information about the finances, of not letting you have access to the finances. If you can't have access to a credit card or a checking account or, Apple Pay on your phone, then you're rendered usually much more economically dependent on your partner, and that limits tangible options for you. For individuals where causes more sort of psychological distress in the victim.
What, if any, role can shame or humiliation play in this coercive dynamic?
So that's one of the emotions that the victim is usually trying to suppress and compartmentalize and avoid and put away. One of the most frequently felt feelings after something so incredibly humiliating and violating is shame. And shame is a very sort of difficult emotion for people to have to live with and to have to experience. And then a lot of times what we see in these relationships, especially ones where sexual assault is perpetrated, there's typically the emotional abuse as well. So now if you're called names like a whore and a slut and easy and fat, and you're feeling the shame from the sexual assault that just happened, it sort of acts as a compounding effect, and it sort of kind of slowly deteriorates the psychological functioning of the victim, and where they're just really trying to get back to the good guy, get the good guy to come back, but they're suffering these symptoms underneath.
What about intimidation? What role does intimidation play in the coercive control dynamic?
And intimidation is one of the huge factors that we see in coercive control. Again, the goal is to get your partner to do what you want them to do. And if you've established that you can use violence and other sexual violence and physical violence, slamming your hand on a table, throwing a glass, breaking a door, throwing anything, causing a fit, yelling and screaming, that can rise the fear level in a victim that she may modify her behavior quicker, and he might not need to use physical violence because he's already established that fear is there.
What, if any, role could writing obscene messages play in being considered an intimidating behavior?
Objection leading.
I said, what if any?
Overruled.
I mean, certainly writing obscene messages to your partner could absolutely be an intimidating behavior.
What, if any, role does emotional abuse or degradation play in the dynamics?
So emotional abuse and degradation, as I stated before, functions to decrease your sense of self-worth. It decreases your sense of agency. It makes you feel bad about yourself. And when you feel bad about yourself, you're less likely to actualize and see options for leaving. You're so sort of mired in this dynamic of abuse that you come sometimes to believe the bad things that the person is telling you about. So, maybe I am not talented and fat and lazy and stupid, and it interferes with that ability to problem solve and figure out, can I get out of this relationship? And sometimes you feel you don't even deserve to get out of the relationship when the abuse is so chronic and so repetitive.
What role does surveillance as a means of control play in that dynamic?
So surveillance...
Objection leading.
I don't think that's leading, Your Honor.
Overruled. Go ahead.
So surveillance functions to let the victim know wherever you are, there I am. So it makes her feel not secure in her movement, feeling that she has to restrict her movement. Her movement is not hers alone. It usually increases hypervigilance. It increases fear. It increases the need for yourself to mark where you've been and what you've done so that you can go back and prove it to your partner, because you know that there is going to be an interrogation later. When this pattern has been established, show receipts, show me your iPhone. Where were you? What's your Google location at? Those are some types of surveillance behaviors that puts the victim very much on edge and increases that level of anxiety and trepidation.
What role does possessive jealousy play in these relationships?
So possessive jealousy is a very difficult dynamic in intimate partner violence. It's very common in situations of coercive control. It's rooted in possession, that the gentleman feels that he can possess her and that he can have her whenever he wants. It's very possessive dynamic. But the accusations, the problem is when you make the accusations, the woman's forced to refute the accusations. So they're continuing in this dynamic where she's trying to prove, I didn't do what you said, this didn't happen. And then unfortunately, sometimes it escalates because the man is not taking the no for an answer, because this is a perseverative, obsessive pattern that's very difficult to penetrate, that often these type of conversations lend themselves to physical and sexual violence.
Does this dynamic happen overnight?
No, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time. We don't, a woman doesn't get into a relationship with a man who's beating her up and sexually assaulting her and calling her names and doing all that. She gets into the relationships for all the right reasons, just like we all get into relationships, for love, for companionship, for kindness, for a future. But then slowly, all of these behaviors start to take form. And I say it's sort of like sucking the oxygen out of the room, and then before you know it, you're suffocating.
So And that brings me to my next question. What role do physical abuse and coercive tactics play interspersed with normalcy and positive moments?
Objection compound.
Sustained objection.
Okay. I'll figure this out some way. What role does love and normalcy play in these dynamics you've been describing?
Objection compound.
Overruled.
Thank you.
So love and normalcy are almost always in these relationships. That, when you are in a lull and the violence is not happening, you're back to sort of the loving man that you wanted, the person who you wanted to be with. And when you pair sort of this violent dynamic, physical violence, sexual violence, with love and attachment, it creates a trauma bond. It creates a psychological bond. An emotional dependency is created. So it makes it very difficult for the victim of the abuse to sort of extricate herself from that relationship, and for her to even believe, frankly, that takes a lot of time to even believe that she can and that she should.
And what, if any, role does that dynamic you've described have in the victim thinking they can fix the problem?
So what do we know from the research with working with battered men who come into treatment, is that the only person who can change the abuse is the abuser. So no matter what the tactics that the woman uses, she's trying to do all these different things to fix him, to have him not be violent, to have him not be sexually violent, to have him not be obsessively jealous. And all those things don't change his behavior, because it's up to him to change his behavior. And this was played out a million times in the batterers intervention groups that I led. And the men would tell us, it doesn't matter what she does. I don't care. So the problem is that the woman continues to think that she can fix it, and yet she can't. But she's the one who's then rendered sort of helpless and hopeless because everything that she's trying to do is failing.
What is the cycle of violence?
So the cycle of violence is one way to describe this domestic violence pattern. Typically what we see, and the cycle can be different in a variety of relationships, but typically what we see is in the first phase, so sort of multiple 3 to 4 phases. In the first phase, there's a tension building phase. You're sort of starting to feel that apprehension. He may be throwing his papers on the table a little more. He may be slamming the fridge door a little more. He may be mumbling under his mouth a little more. He may grab a glass a little more forcefully than he normally is. And then there's the incident phase. Then there's the blow up, where the violence, the abuse, the screaming, the sexual violence or the physical violence, all that occurs. Then we come to the contrition phase. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. It wasn't me. I'm not going to do it again. The promises for change. And then we sort of slide into the calm phase where, this isn't going to happen again. I'm back to stable ground. I'm going to live in this place, this sort of honeymoon place. The problem in the calm phase is we often see the rationalizations and the justifications for the behavior. It's not like typically the man is taking full responsibility for what he did, but it's calm because there's no, violence and no sort of tension at that moment. And then it recurs. And then it recurs. So you're stuck in this vicious cycle of trying to figure out, how can I be with this man who hurts me, and yet I love him so much.
What, if anything, does the term love bomb mean?
So the love bombing is, it's more of the colloquial term for the younger folks here, but, where you shower someone with affection and love, in this contrition and calm phase where, everything about you is special. You're the best thing in the world. I'm never going to do anything to hurt you again. I would never let anyone hurt you. And it could be sending flowers and buying gifts or going on trips or your favorite restaurant. And that is, a way of where the man is trying to make those amends. And then it gets the woman hooked. So they get hooked on the kindness. They get hooked on the love. They don't get hooked on the abuse. I've never met one woman in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that I've evaluated who was not concerned about the violence. They're all concerned about the violence. But they go for the love.
So, In your experience with these dynamics that you've described, does the victim ever yell at her partner?
Absolutely.
Why?
We know from the research that women use verbal and physical acts of aggression in these relationships. That's not uncommon. This has been researched for 5 decades. And a woman may yell at her partner because she's angry. And anger is a very normal emotion to having been abused. She can also be afraid, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can absolutely, as human beings, feel 2 or 3 or 4 different emotions at once. People do often say to me, oh, she would never yell at him if she knew he was going to hit her. And that's not true. That's just patently not true. That's not supported in the research, and that's not supported in my clinical practice. The problem is there's a classic double bind, and the violence has been so normalized in the relationship now. She gets hit if she does yell, she gets hit if she doesn't yell. So for women who feel at certain moments that they need to preserve some sense of their autonomy and their independence, stand up to themselves, they will yell and they will fight back, even though the risk of violence is there. So it doesn't mean that she's not afraid and that she's not concerned about the violence. And it doesn't mean she doesn't also use placating and compliance strategies most of the time as well.
In the cases that you have and in your experience, does the abuse typically take place in front of others?
No, this is classically what we talk about behind closed doors. Most of the intimate partner violence, the domestic violence, happens, in the privacy of your own home. So sometimes we see the remnants of it, the after effects, or victims talk to their friends or family about it, but very rarely are you seeing it happen, the actual blow-up phase happen in the middle of witnesses and other people.
What does the term bystander effect mean?
So bystander effect means what happens when people are aware that domestic violence is happening. What happens when they're aware, even if they're not seeing it, that it could be happening. And what happens is we know that it's very difficult for people to stand up and say something. It's very difficult, especially in situations where there's a larger community of folks and the person who perhaps is perpetrating the abuse is the leader of that community. It becomes very difficult to go up against that, to go up against the sort of the head honcho of the community. People are very fearful of losing their jobs. I've seen this time and time again in the cases that I've worked on, either the Boy Scout cases or the clergy abuse cases, all of those type of cases where the USA Gymnastics, where when we go back and we look, we see people knew. But the secretary doesn't want to lose her job. She has kids to feed. The guy who, checks you in, he doesn't want to lose his job because he has a mortgage to pay. So people are quiet and they don't say anything. And then other people are very, it's a very worrisome dynamic. They don't want to put their foot out there if they're wrong, and maybe I didn't see it right, or I don't really know what happened. I certainly am not going to jeopardize my job if I don't really know what happened behind closed doors, even if I see a trashed room or a bruise. And then people still believe it's a family matter. It's between Amber and Johnny. Let them figure it out. I'm not going to get in the middle. So those are dynamics that happen.
What's the objection?
Motion to strike.
What's the objection?
We identified 2 names in the answer.
Overruled. Next.
Thank you. Did you finish your answer?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. What about mutual abuse? What is that? What role does that play?
So mutual abuse isn't really a term of art that we use. What we look at is situational couple violence and intimate partner violence. And when we look at situational couple violence, that really does characterize the majority of types of violence and abuse that happens in relationships. That's when a couple gets out of hand, they may push, shove, slap, yell, say some things that they don't want, and it's not that those behaviors are okay, but those are sort of what our larger scale community-based studies say happens in these relationships. That's distinguished from intimate partner violence, what I'm talking to you about, that has this constellation of symptoms and is rooted in the abuse of power and control.
Is there research that addresses this mutual abuse?
Yeah, there's research that addresses what does gender symmetry look like, male and female, are they the same? And there's certainly, as I said, research that on the lower end types of violent behaviors, push, shove, slap, we may see similar rates between men and women. In psychological aggression, yelling, name calling, putting down, in some of our big community scale studies, we may see similar rates of perpetration in those behaviors. But then there are, other situations where we don't have gender symmetry. And what the research talks about very clearly is you have to examine context. You have to examine the differential of power and control and coercive control in the relationship to make a full determination.
Do women use violence in relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we've known this for 5 decades in our research. We've been studying this since the 70s. And when we look at what happens, women do report their use of violence. The majority of violence that we do see is what we call reactive violence or self-defensive violence, or sometimes violence that's perpetrated independently of an assault, of something that's going on. But mostly that when the partner begins to become violent, then she may become violent and fight back. And that's not an uncommon dynamic, that if somebody is being pushed or shoved or hit, that a person would fight back. That has been established in the research.
And what, if any, effect does that have on changing the power dynamics or the structure?
Well, you have to find out, does it? Does her use of violence change the overarching power structure of coercive control and violence and abuse in this relationship? And you have to examine those variables to see, does it or does it not?
Can men be victims of intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. Certainly, we know that we have to be careful of gendered stereotypes. We can't go in and think, oh, only the woman is the victim and only the man is the perpetrator. That just does not comport with the research. We know that the research also shows that we can have domestic violence in same-sex relationships. My very first case was a same-sex domestic violence homicide in Brooklyn. That was in 1998. So I've been examining and treating individuals in a variety of types of violent contexts. So we have to be careful that that bias doesn't get in our way when we're evaluating a particular situation in a particular case. That said, we do know that there still are differences. In a heterosexual couple, in a male-female dyad, the research still is clear that there are differences. Men still perpetrate more severe acts of violence. Women are still more likely to be injured. They are much more likely to suffer sexual violence at the hands of their partner. They're more likely to be intimidated, afraid, and they're much more likely to be killed. So we know that those differences exist, but we do examine, in those individual circumstances, knowing that either one could be a perpetrator or a victim.
So how are you able to determine whether a relationship is a situational violence or intimate partner violence?
So I thoroughly examine all of those other variables. I look for the coercive control, who holds the power in the situation, who's able to say no, who makes the decisions, what are the consequences if you don't follow the decisions of your partner, is there sexual violence, is there intimidation and fear? Are there statistical factors that are associated with severe and lethal domestic violence? So there's a lot of data that we have in the field that we can use to assess a particular relationship and really find out what's going on.
Does alcohol and substance use cause people to be violent?
No, it certainly doesn't cause people to be violent. We have plenty of people who can be, struggling with substance abuse and addiction, and they're not violent. But when you have a substance abuse and addiction and you perpetrate domestic violence, it does create a much more disastrous effect. It is a co-occurring variable, and we know that also from the research that the majority of the women will report that when their partner is drinking, the physical violence goes up. So a lot of the times when he's physically violent is when he's been consuming drugs or alcohol. When he's not consuming drugs and alcohol and he's not violent, those other behaviors continue to persist. The coercive control, the surveillance, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the psychological abuse, those usually persist. But the alcohol can just throw lighter fluid on a flame in a situation of domestic violence.
Is there research that looks at how women cope with the violence and abuse in their relationships?
Yes, there is.
Please tell me about it. What does it say?
So there's been a lot of research to talk about what do women do. That's the question that everyone wants to know. Why doesn't she just leave? And in asking that question, why doesn't she just leave, we actually are able to say, well, let me tell you what she does do. And what the research shows is women do a lot of things in that relationship. So sort of three main categories. One are the formal responses, the formal things that she does. Call the police, participate in prosecution of your partner, go see a therapist, go to a shelter, go to a hospital. These are sort of the very formal strategies that women can use. Then there are the informal strategies, and that's talking with your best friend, talking with your mom, talking with your friends, trying to get that emotional support from your social network. But the most common one is these personal strategies. And the personal strategies are really talking with your partner. They're trying to fix the relationship from within the confines of the relationship. You know, trying to get him to go to counseling, try to get him to go to church, try to get him to understand his ways, try to get him to get into AA or sober counseling or harm reduction model to help with his addiction. Compliance with his demands, anticipating his demands, all these coping strategies that are sort of, you know, embedded within that intimate relationship.
Let's talk about the calling the police. Is that a common response?
It's not a common response. Many women do not want to call the police on their partners. You know, using criminal justice interventions in crimes of women and children are the least likely to be called into law enforcement. And most of the time when the police are called, it's because a particular incident has got out of hand and she feels unsafe. And the only way that she feels I can get this incident to end and stop is by calling law enforcement.
And if police are called, does the woman typically participate in the prosecution?
I mean, this has been a problem and a difficulty for prosecutors across the country since I've been doing this work. I'm actually frequently called by the prosecutor to testify about a fact pattern because the victim won't come in and testify. So dropping restraining orders, not participating in the prosecution is a very common dynamic in situations of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And what we know and what we know from our law enforcement data and colleagues is that when you get that 911 call, they're very specifically trained to say, that's likely not the first episode. The chances are there have been more severe episodes before you get this call. So you can't go on the scene and think that this is the first episode of violence. And that's why a thorough assessment is supposed to be done when police officers arrive on the scene. So usually that episode that calls the police is just meant to stop that incident in that moment, to get a sense of safety. But most women don't want to participate and go forward with restraining orders.
Why do women in violent relationships stay in the relationship when the man's hurting?
I mean, they stay for all the reasons we talked about in the cycle of violence. They stay for the loving man. They stay for the man who's kind. They stay for the man they decided to marry and had hope and promises for their future. So there's a lot of sort of love and attachment is why they're connected to their partner. Some people stay because they have economic reasons and they don't have tangible resources to leave. Some people have children in common and they don't want to deprive their children of a father. So some people fear retaliation. If I leave, I'm going to get seriously hurt. And frankly, the statistics bear it out. The most dangerous time for a woman is when she's leaving that relationship. Her likelihood of being killed grows substantially at that moment. So leaving sometimes isn't a best strategy. Staying keeps her safe. So there's usually a multitude of factors of why a woman decides to stay in the relationship. And again, as I said previously, it doesn't mean she's unconcerned about the violence. It's just she hasn't figured out a way out yet.
What, if any, role does emotional attachment and love play in that?
That's, probably the biggest one, is that you have this, we talked about that trauma bond that has developed, that psychological attachment to your partner. You don't want to leave him. You've connected with him on so many other levels that giving that up just feels like a threat to your integrity. You're just and a threat to his, because you're just so intertwined and attached.
What, if any, role does hope and optimism play?
Hope and optimism are really what keeps victims alive in these situations. That's what gets them going from one episode to the next, to get up the next day, and maybe he's not going to drink today. Maybe it's going to be on his good side. Maybe he's going to come home and not disappear for 3 days. Continuing to hope that some type of change is coming down the road.
Now, you mentioned lethality a little earlier. Can you please explain to us what that means?
Means death, means fatality, and we have very well validated instruments and data that looks at what factors happen in a relationship where a woman ends up dead. And we do that through looking retrospectively, saying, here's, this person ended up dead, killed by her partner in a homicide, and let's see what factors were there so that we can work at preventing it. It's very methodologically sound over different case control designs over multiple cities, viewed by the FBI and law enforcement. So these are a number of factors that tell us that somebody is in a very dangerous situation. So some of the factors are an increase of frequency and severity of the violence, threats to kill, choking behavior, sexual assault, obsessive and possessive jealousy, controlling behavior, the perpetrator's use and abuse of substances, alcohol and substances, the perpetrator's threatening of suicide himself. Right? Those are some of the top factors, and there are more that are very, very dangerous. When we hear that and we hear a woman is in a situation where those are present, then we are moving out of situational couple violence.
What, if any, role does destroying property?
And destroying property, destruction of property, personal property is also one of the risk factors for danger and fatality.
And what, if any, role does leaving threatening messages play?
Yep. That's also a risk factor for lethality.
What are the psychological and traumatic effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
Objection compound.
Psychological and traumatic effects are kind of interchangeable.
I'll sustain.
What are the psychological effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
So these have also been well researched, and they are wide and varied. We see depression and depressive disorders, sometimes with suicidality. We see anxiety and anxiety disorders, a lot of stress. We see post-traumatic stress disorder. We see substance abuse and substance abuse disorders. We see trust difficulties and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. As a result, we see a lot of shame and humiliation. We see anger and rage, a whole sleep disruption, a whole host of difficult psychological consequences having sustained a relationship of intimate partner violence.
What, if any, role does low self-esteem play?
Well, low self-esteem is a very common after effect, and that, when you're embedded in the relationship, it also makes it just very difficult for you to climb your way out.
What is emotional dysregulation?
Emotional dysregulation, so the DYS, dysregulation, is when you sort of don't feel that you have control of your emotions. You feel like you're fluctuating, from one to the next. It's not the same as a bipolar disorder. It, can happen in short moments that, it's really because your central nervous system is so out of haywire from being exposed to so many traumatic events that you may feel things quickly with a short trigger in a very quick time.
In your experience, is there a particular way victims of intimate partner violence remember the violence they endured?
Well, memory for traumatic events is something that has been well researched. Sometimes people have what we call dissociative amnesia, where because of the physical or psychic pain of what they're going through, a portion of the memory either gets blocked or it can't get retrieved. Whether it's stored or retrieval, we're not really sure. But most of the times, the memory is really about when you have multiple repeated events of the